My name is Ron Schleck from BTB Security. Some of you may already know me. I've worked with some of you in the past. Just to go over quickly my background, I've worked almost solely in IT security. I actually started off in law enforcement and then moved into IT security. A little bit of an interesting story, but still remain active in emergency services in a couple different aspects, basically in a volunteer capacity, and some part-time work just to kind of keep my certifications up to date. But I've been working in IT security for 15 years now. My experience includes not only time here at BTB Security, since I'm one of the founders here, but then also worked as a CISO for Penn National Gaming, Harleysville Insurance, and then before that worked as a manager of professional services for SunGuard Availability Services and as a consultant for Ernst & Young. Reason I'm giving you the background there is just to show you that, kind of like everybody here at BTB Security, not just about being consultants and kind of give you that consulting point of view, which I think can be a little bit misguided if it's the only thing that you've done in your career, but we actually do have a good mix of experience on both sides of the table, meaning that we actually understand what it means, and I think what we tell people is a little bit more actionable and realistic when it comes down to it. As far as the company is concerned, BTB Group or BTB Security was founded back in 2006. We have offices in Philadelphia and Chicago for right now. We do have coverage nationally. So this is kind of just the background of our company, the partners, and again, like I had said, it includes not only consulting experience, but then also some of the diversified experience in running security consulting organizations or acting as a CISO, Director of Security. As far as how we do incident response, which is what this case study is really all about, there's a couple different types of ways just to give you a background on how we engage with a client. We do a couple different things. One is that at time of disaster, so if somebody hasn't engaged with us previously, maybe has met us, gotten some information from us, liked what they've seen, and remembers that we do incident response and forensic examinations, people may contact us, people that we haven't been engaged with before in an incident response capacity. We also have retainer services, where essentially it's a service level agreement for dedicated resources, and we have on response, preliminary type work that we work for those clients. Again, this is more of a retainer service where we're dedicated and we have people ready to respond within a certain time period. We get to know the client a little bit better, and we're ready to respond basically anytime an incident may come up. This covers anything from what I would consider lower level HR type incidents, the whole way to very high level breach investigations or incident response type activities. And then of course the last one there is actually our managed security offering, the Rapid Advanced Detection and Response, or RADAR. Something that was actually born out of this case that we'll be talking about today, but has intelligent monitoring, a little bit more of an accelerated response since we are actually engaged in the infrastructure. We have a lot of things deployed as far as endpoints, server monitoring, network type monitoring, and a lot of advanced intelligence feeds and capacities in there. Our incident response methodology is much like a lot of other companies out there, just kind of running on this just to kind of set the foundation for what we'll be talking about here. Methodology, obviously we go through preparation period, so if we have somebody on retainer, get to know their infrastructure, their policies, the people that may be working there, and the type of policies and procedures that they have in the case of an incident. Of course that goes into identification. So really relying on the monitoring capabilities, whether that be your typical things that are found in an infrastructure like firewall monitoring, intrusion detection, or advanced type things such as in our radar solution. Containment goes down to how those people react, what capabilities they have internally to be able to contain something, and really segment that off or sandbox it and move forward. Then of course the methodology moves into eradication, obviously getting rid of the threat, recovery, once it's eradicated, and then that last step, which is kind of going over the lessons learned, whether that be anecdotal or actually looking at maybe some areas for improvement where technology or processes or people may have failed, or there's an opportunity for improvement in an incident response. As far as what we normally see, starting to get into the case study here, most incidents that we work, it's stuff that you see in the news rather frequently, unfortunately. Stuff like credit cards, so credit card information being exfiltrated, things being used or basically sold in a capacity where they're really just worried about the volume of credit cards or intellectual property that's basically either sold or used in some type of incident. The other part would be access. All of these things really come down to something to sell or barter. With credit cards and intellectual property or access to an infrastructure, what we've typically seen is that these people aren't using them directly, but they're using them to sell or barter for other access to botnets, whatever it may be. The biggest one here, believe it or not, is access. Just gaining access to an infrastructure, being able to set up a botnet, or using some type of redirect to basically show a connection through whoever may be compromised, and then selling that connection to hide an identity or launch an attack, whatever it may be. This is what we typically see when we're working a breach or an incident. We sometimes see things that are done for political reasons. We do have companies that are a little bit higher profile. You see some hacktivism type stuff. Competitive intelligence, a little bit, just because there are some, almost everybody has some type of intellectual property, whether it be a specific product offering or research that may be going on for new type of product or service, whatever it may be. And like I said, that hacktivism kind of goes back to those political reasons. See that every so often, and a lot of times, like was with the case with Anonymous and what they were already doing. If they're deeming something to be a target, the bottom line is that they've probably already taken it over. So a lot of that stuff is really in response, as opposed to when somebody says that they're going to take something over, somebody like Anonymous, they probably already have access to something, and usually it's just used to prove that they have the capabilities, people should fear them, basically trying to promote some type of political note or movement. Rarely do we see script kiddies anymore, or the low-level attacks. Most of the technology that's out there nowadays has really, sort of called this type of activity. The script kiddies or the low-level attacks have really been thwarted just because, a lot of the stuff that's out there as far as intrusion detection, firewalls, web application firewalls, and even in the monitoring capacities and how people react to them, stuff is pretty, caught pretty quickly and identified as just a scan or some type of automated tool that's out there, and can be quickly dismissed. Obviously, a lot of the stuff that falls into this category is things that are known vulnerabilities, and this is again why we go back to talking to clients, making sure that things are patched up, things are basically in good shape, because they do still occur, but rarely are we called in when there's some type of attack like that, because they're very low level, and quite honestly, if there's any difference or change in the environment, even if there is a vulnerability, most of the time they're so unsophisticated that they don't know what to do if they get access. Just a note here on forensic examinations, we will kind of talk about it as part of this case study. We do the forensic examinations. Obviously, we're certified forensic experts. We do them as part of incident response when the evidence leads us there, or done when a computer device is used in the commission of a crime or nefarious action. And the only reason I bring this up is that a lot of people, when they think about incident response, immediately jump to forensic examinations. And it's a part of our methodology. It's a part of what we do and kind of our toolkit when we attack a problem like this. But that doesn't mean that every incident that we work actually comes to a forensic examination. However, it was part of this one, so I just wanted to bring that up. This incident and what we'll be talking about here, persistent and escalated access over a long period of time. Long period to some, We're looking at July right now for 2014, and I'm sure everybody on the phone is kind of scratching their head wondering where the year has gone and whether you're on track with your projects or not. We kind of feel the same way, but for an attack, this was persistent, very slow moving. They would get access to things and just kind of propagate and then try to gain further access. This incident was also internationally originated with ties to some U.S. perpetrators. So it was something that was born out of another country. However, they had to have actors in the United States to carry out some of the actions. This was eventually linked to organized crime. So there was an organized crime structure, and there was insulation built into the attack. We'll call it the attack pyramid. What I mean by this is that there were often very blind controls or commands given to people that really had no idea what they were doing or why they were doing it. So things were being escalated, being passed back, basically up through the chain, and then people would get different commands. So they had multiple people working in multiple different capacities, and they were all kind of coordinating it behind the scenes. There were handlers and then also foot soldiers for in-person needs, which is where we'll get into why this was a little bit of a different breach for us. But there actually were people involved in going and doing things, carrying things out, testing certain pieces, trying different things, and then seeing how far they could take it. And this incident, which we felt was kind of interesting, was that it wasn't about gaining access to information and then selling it on the black market. It was actually about cash in hand type situations. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about this actual incident. But it was cash in hand. At the end of the day, if everything would have worked correctly, there would have been cash for those foot soldiers, and then it would have gone right down the line and actually gone back up to the crime structure and back to the people that really kind of coordinated this entire event. Target overview, just to give you an idea: mid-sized financial services company in the greater Philadelphia area, pretty large size, over $4 billion in assets. It's fair. Medium maturity with regards to IT and security. So they've been a player in the area, have been growing very rapidly. Hired a director of security in 2012. Before that, that's not to say that they did nothing. They had actually done a lot, but it all kind of fell on the director of IT at the time. So not until a few years ago did they actually put somebody in place that was in charge of security and actually had security organization and really a plan to move forward. The monitoring, there was monitoring in place, but nothing really on the high end. So again, going back to that maturity, about medium, which is what we would consider them. So in the beginning, just to give you an idea of how this all started, Secret Service directly contacted the bank, basically with one sentence, and then they kind of bowed out. They have a cash out scheme is coming in the following weeks, and inroads have been made to your IT assets. And that was pretty much it. I mean, there was not any information that was given to this client or this target at the time to indicate how far they had gotten, how much of a coordinated attack it had been, how long this had been going on. Basically no information. Those two pieces of information were really it. And again, this wasn't something that even the Secret Service had tons of information about. They were actually going off of a tip from a confidential informant. So they couldn't even really tell how much of it was correct, how much of it was true. We were just kind of going off of exactly those two statements. A little bit more about the target. Mostly a Windows and Cisco environment. Fairly typical. This is what we see kind of day in and day out with most of our clients. Typical banking applications, several outsourced or hosted. They did insource IT back in 2011, 2012. They had, quote-unquote compliant security controls. I'm sure if I unmuted you all, you'd probably be a little bit of, some chuckling in the audience, but we all know what this means, and we kind of preach it day in and day out. Compliance doesn't equal security. And sometimes security doesn't even equal compliance, just because we know how this all works. But they were technically compliant. They had the right controls in place. They were doing the right assessments. They were basically doing IT risk assessments, and they have been and continue to do IT risk assessments for new applications that they spin up, doing regular infrastructure vulnerability assessments, regular penetration testing, including internal testing, physical testing, social engineering, wireless, external, the whole 9 yards. And then also as a financial institution with their online banking and money transfer and a lot of those applications, doing regular web application assessments. So they were doing the right things. They were on the right track. What the target saw, since they were notified by the Secret Service of these couple things, was basically it. This isn't a joke. I did leave this intentionally blank because they didn't see anything. All they had and all we were working on at that point was that the Secret Service notified them that inroads had been made into the environment and there was a coordinated attack underway. So it was a little bit scary. They were completely blind. Nothing was going off. They didn't have any major alarms on their SIM solution. No firewall alerts, server alerts, fraud monitoring, nothing. So you ask, well, what all did they really have in place if they didn't see anything? It's pretty typical, what we would consider commodity type solutions that have been in place or that were in place. They had their firewalls, they had their SIM solution, antivirus on, well, quote unquote everything, because we did, almost in any infrastructure you'll find a couple things where you might have some blind spots. They did have data leakage protection, content filtering, and intrusion detection. Looking at it a little bit more, the firewalls, they didn't really have any segmentation. So internally, it was a pretty flat network. And with any environment, there's always areas that may or should be VLAN'd off or segregated, just to make sure that there's some level of sophistication as far as what needs to be done, jumping to different networks. The other thing here was that there was no egress filtering. So, if you're starting a connection from an inbound point or a trusted type of endpoint, outbound, there was actually nothing in place to collect or to see any of that activity. As many of you probably know, a lot of the command and control type bots that are out there, and even a lot of the incidents that we see nowadays, are started by pieces of malware, and then they kind of go from there. If you establish that outbound connection and you're not doing any egress filtering, it's kind of like the Wild West. You can tunnel and basically make it look like encrypted traffic over port 443 or 80. Nobody will ever find it. For the SIM, they had critical assets covered. And this is something that we see day in and day out. It comes down to money, and we understand that, and completely empathize with a lot of our customers when they're doing this information and event monitoring. Their critical assets were covered, and that was pretty much it. They had gone through the risk assessment years prior, looked at what was absolutely critical to them from a technology standpoint, and critical for their business, and said, well, we have to do monitoring. To monitor these particular assets, it may cost us $500 a server. We can't cover everything, but let's go through and cover our critical assets. As everyone knows, this isn't necessarily always where an attack starts. It may start on a server that has no value, or was basically booted up or started as a test server. That doesn't mean that it can't be used to get some type of persistent access, and then eventually help the intruder mask itself as a normal user, where things wouldn't be seen or wouldn't be looked at in a way that would draw any suspicion. The other part of this, as far as the SIM solution goes, is that it wasn't monitored 24/7, 365. Again, this comes down to money. A lot of people don't have the budget for an FTE to specifically be looking at monitoring. A couple different people in place within the security organization, security administrator, basically creating accounts, taking down accounts, doing more of the administrative functions, an analyst that's doing some of this monitoring, but does have other functions. And this is where we start to talk about how much we're pushing our resources internally. So they definitely weren't covering everything, and they weren't looking at it all of the time or as much as they could have been. Antivirus, again, You know, we've all struggled with this at one point. You do miss things. There's always going to be parts of your infrastructure where you might have a blind spot. The other part of this is something that, has changed rather recently, or in the past 6 months. Something that we've been talking to a lot of people about, just because our managed security service is that signature-based look, and having one vendor. So of course, if you have a signature-based antivirus and you're not doing any heuristics, information monitoring on those endpoints, you're probably going to miss stuff, because there's still a little bit of a lag time between when a new attack comes out or a new piece of malware comes out and when the antivirus vendor will actually have a signature for it and actually use it. That's not only the signature-based problem, but then also one vendor. They had one vendor across the board on their servers, their endpoints, even at the gateways as far as what was going on with their mail filtering. So if you're relying on that signature-based antivirus vendor, obviously there's an opportunity, basically just a lag in timing where something could potentially get through. The data leakage protection, pretty good actually. It's a solution that we all kind of like and have worked with before. They were just doing it on mail only. There wasn't really any monitoring, not really any staff that were in tune with the actual product that's in place. They were really doing it for compliance purposes, making sure that none of the information as far as account numbers or PII or Social Security numbers leaked outbound via email. So this was good, but at the same time there was an opportunity for improvement. The content filtering, again, came down to just mail and the web, and it was not fully deployed at the time. And I'm sure there's probably a handful of people on the call today that have heard when they've started to do content filtering, oh, it's slowing down my web experience, or I can't get to this website or that website. And this is exactly what this client had run into. It's something that they had purchased, that they had started to deploy. People didn't like it. It was too restrictive. They started as a fairly small financial services company, so people were kind of used to having wide open internet. They started to pull that back in, and people weren't very comfortable with it, and people didn't like it. So there was a lot of political pushback, and this is why it wasn't fully deployed. And then intrusion detection, again, not really being fully monitored, and the placement of it, basically that implementation was kind of poor. So they kind of fell down as far as not really selecting the solution. It was a great solution, but how it was implemented and what they were actually looking at. So, where do we start? If we get an incident, and this is a client that we had been engaged in doing the security assessments for, but we had really never done incident response for them. We weren't on retainer for them or anything like that. But if you know us at all, we're always willing to help and kind of jump in. But when we came across this incident, when we were pulled into it, where do we start just to try to help them as much as we can? So obviously that first part, preserve any evidence found. And I kind of laugh about this one. I'm like, well, that one was really easy because there wasn't anything. We hadn't found anything. They hadn't found anything in the logs. There was nothing as far as their SIM was concerned. Intrusion detection hadn't picked up anything. There was nothing. What we did, we had done several assessments before, but we kind of jumped into that incident response mode, gathering intelligence on the infrastructure, different applications that could potentially be involved in the type of scheme that the Secret Service had notified them about. Basically just that quick cash out scheme linked to debit cards or credit cards. Discuss the scenarios for cash out. And again, this goes back to not just the technology and the solutions that might be in play, but actually sitting down and understanding the business, which is, I think, one of our strong points in this case study here. We sat down with the fraud monitoring team, the company that actually did the credit card processing, the ATM network. It was kind of a full-blown assessment on the business logic around what would actually have to happen for this cash-out scheme to occur. So we didn't just focus solely on the technology, but again, talking to the business leaders, the people in these areas that knew these systems and also the processes inside and out to fully understand what we were looking at. The other part of this, which was a little bit more interesting, was coordinating the effort with the outsourced providers of those applications. So, as I had mentioned, most people do not own their own ATM network. That's just not something that banks do anymore. There are networks out there. If you look at the ATMs when you're going up to them, Star Network, there's a couple other ones out there. This is something where getting to know and understanding what type of controls that they had, not only on the network and how the bank's applications interfaced with that particular network, but then also their fraud monitoring controls, their technology infrastructure, and what they may be able to provide as far as information and how that all kind of linked back to the information that was at our client. So working with them was a little bit interesting because they're a provider. As we all have vendors, we know that some people give you what they give you, and that's kind of it. So they were able to come up with logs, but at the same time we were able to push them a little bit more just because of the situation to give us more information and work with them to try to get the type of information that we were looking for to help us in this investigation. And then we were also coordinating efforts with another firm. So being in a regulated environment, there was one regulator in particular that had basically forced the issue in bringing in Mandiant. Mandiant, as some of you may well know, is a well-recognized firm. They do a lot of incident investigations, data breach investigations. They're focused a little bit more on the actual pieces of malware or the endpoints and analyzing those. They kind of get down into the weeds with a lot of that stuff. Not saying that we don't. Their methodology is a little bit different. They'll start attacking and looking at the malware very specifically. They're very interested in how that malware works and what it may have done, whereas we were really looking at the overall business approach, how the attack may have started at that point, how somebody with access may have been masking themselves and doing things, set themselves up in a manner where they could continue and actually pull off this attack. But we were working with them. We work with them actually rather frequently. They're really good at what they do as far as the reverse engineering and malware analysis. When we get stuff like this, we actually rely on them for it. So we've used them in the past just because we don't have a bench of 40 consultants that can sit around and reverse engineer malware. That's not our strong suit. It'll never be our strong suit. I don't think I could pay somebody to sit around and reverse engineer malware, but these guys are really good at it. And then of course one of the other things was coordinating with federal law enforcement. They had the information. The Secret Service had the relationship with the confidential informant. They didn't have tons of information around how it had happened, and quite honestly they didn't really understand even how it could have occurred, but coordinating with them, getting resources, and in the long run we actually ended up with, on the prosecutorial side, helping them and talking with the confidential informant to try to get a little bit further into the organization and kind of help their case along. And then of course, the last thing and probably the most important thing is keeping the customer calm, cool, collected, coordinated, and informed. Something that we joke about, but at the same time, this is really why we're here. This is really why we provide these types of services. When we talk to clients and we, basically are in a situation like this, we have to be very methodical. And making sure that somebody stays calm when they're undergoing some type of attack like this is absolutely paramount, just because they need to be able to focus, get the resources that they need, and have somebody help them coordinate those types of things, but also be reassured that we're going to take care of it, we're going to move forward, we're going to make progress on this issue. And it's not something to be taken lightly, but let's move in a calm, cool, and collected way as opposed to generating mass chaos. I'm going to run through this timeline. Just bear with me here. There's a number of slides here, but it'll just give you an idea of how things occurred and sort of how things played out. Day one, we'll go back to that, the initial contact by the Secret Service. By day two, we were engaged. Since we did understand that there was IDS in place and understood very quickly, because we had done several assessments with this client before, that the IDS sensor really wasn't in the best spot, really wasn't up to snuff, we actually deployed our own IDS sensor. We did this to monitor the internet traffic, basically look at not only what was coming in, but then also the egress points for this particular client. The only reason that we did this again was just because what they had in place had been deployed. There wasn't a lot of thought on architecture, and the alerts and basically the signatures that they had already put on the IDS weren't really up to snuff. So we started looking at it. We dropped ours in, and I say with intelligence because we have threat feeds and different things in there, like emerging threats and virus total and things like that, that actually help us pick up a little bit more information. On day 3, the IDS had identified malware on 2 systems. We'll just call them user 1 and user 2. This is where we got into that forensic examination. With any systems that we looked at, we took a little bit of a different approach. So every system that was identified to have some type of malware on it or some type of activity that was nefarious, we did a quick forensic investigation, basically just a very high level look to see if anything really popped out at us. Does it have antivirus? What are the controls that are in place? Has it accepted the group policy for the Windows Active Directory? And then from there, is there any malware that's immediately identifiable? Not taking a super deep approach to it, but just kind of doing a triage type approach. If we saw something, then we would take that next step and go a little bit deeper. On day 4, we did some routing changes. They had multiple connections, and they really didn't have a good reason for it. So what we did was change everything so that it was leaving one connection, which was actually a project that they had in place but really hadn't gotten around to it. So this incident helped them along a little bit, progressed them in the right place. We also did a firewall lockdown where we started doing egress filtering in the web proxy. That content filtering that we had talked about before was actually enforced. So it's all stuff that they had on their plate or had on their strategy for years going forward. We just kind of sped that process up because it needed to happen. So we collapsed down the connections, did that egress filtering, and made sure that the web content filtering or the proxy was actually enforced. On day 5, coming back into it, we were just kind of getting the infrastructure set up correctly so that it would actually facilitate some sort of incident response and actually put them in a better situation as far as security went anyway. We did some internal segmentation. We deployed another IDS sensor at the server segment, basically just enforcing some more roles. We were already looking at the gateway as far as inbound and outbound traffic, but putting another sensor basically where all of their critical information or critical servers were that we had just segmented off to make sure that that's where we wanted to focus our activity. We knew that endpoints could be, kind of soft and squishy and might not have the best security, probably the most susceptibility to some type of attack, but the servers that we had put in that segment, we knew that that's where those things were going to occur if this was going to go forward. We also started doing a little bit more device monitoring. We have something, again, this goes back to our managed service, but the device monitoring that we have is a little bit more lightweight, a little bit easier to deploy, something that we sent out to the servers, different administrators, and basically all of the departments. We started, obviously, where the evidentiary value or where we thought the attack would most likely occur, and then kind of worked from there. Again, starting with the servers, and then went to the different admins, both in IT and then also fraud and money management, people who could move money around or do things with cards or the ATM network, and then started out and going to more of the, I guess, the regular departments, we can call them. We did also notice that there could be man-in-the-middle type attacks, so that it was something that we mitigated right away. And again, all of this stuff really just in support of securing their environment a little bit better, so that we'd be in a better stance to do the incident response, but then also help them be secure. And again, when we talk about the differences between somebody like BTB Security and Mandiant, this is where our focus was a little bit different. While we wanted to lock down the environment and understand what was actually happening with the incident, we also wanted to put them in a spot where this attack, would stop at some point. We were trying to contain this, hopefully eradicate it, and then also put them in a position where the security was much better and it would never happen again. Continuing on, we did some core application hardening, firewalling, account review. We also started working on their fraud monitoring system, just to kind of do an access review, reset roles, and do account resets. So there were things in here that we found As far as access review, they were pretty lax, and this was again a third-party hosted solution. Some of the roles had been changed, so this was this was really the first time that we had seen that somebody had accessed their fraud monitoring solution and had changed roles. So if you guys know anything about banking and how money is transferred, there are velocity rules, timing rules, just like anything. If you think about your ATM card, if you try to withdraw $5,000 in one day, you're probably going to hit some sort of upper limit where you may have to call and reset those things. A lot of those rules were changed for specific accounts. And then there were some accounts that people couldn't account for the access or the passwords, and that's the type of stuff that we went through and actually cleaned up. Day 7, so we're about a week into it, we did find more malware, user 3 we'll call them, cleaned up some unnecessary accounts on the core application. They did reappear. So things that we had pulled off of that application, some of the accounts that we thought were basically based off the business logic and the department admins or the heads of those departments, we pulled accounts off. And some of those things reappeared. So we weren't particularly happy about that, obviously, and had to do a little bit more investigation to see why those things reappeared, who was doing that stuff, and how we might be able to prevent that from happening again. So we knew that they still had some level of access at that point. And then we added some new network-based indicators from information provided by the ATM network, the malware analyzed by Mandiant, and then also information provided by the FBI. So this is where, when we talked about those intrusion detection sensors, and I said, we use them or we utilize them with intelligence. We feed information as the incident was going on back into those IDS sensors and that threat analytics platform to make sure that if there's new information, maybe like things like account numbers or potential pieces of malware or indicators of a piece of malware, whatever it may be, strings or something that's attached to malware or a particular machine, that's the type of stuff that we feed back into the platform. And we're actually doing monitoring on that. So basically just building that set of information that we have to be monitoring on. At that point, day 8, the ATM application access was reviewed with credit card functions. The information that we had was correlated to the core application access, then the administrative functions. And again, this is all just about tying all of the information together. All activity was correlated to IP addresses, and we had that normal activity baseline for the core application. We did find several anomalous accounts that were identified based on the database. Basically, things that on the credit card or the ATM network were set up, but on the core banking application, there may not have been, a real account associated with it. So we saw things that didn't match up, and functions that were different between accounts on the core application or the ATM network or the application for the ATM functions. And this is just the type of stuff that we started to clean up. It was most likely, I think some of this was done in error, just as we all have databases that are probably a little bit sloppy at some point, may have entries or tables that are a little bit sloppy. Some of it was out of that poor database management, but some of it was out of this nefarious activity. So we cleaned all of that up. Day 9, assembled the comprehensive list of cards known to be compromised. So again, this is the type of stuff that, based on what we had seen and the testing that had been done, different things that were run through either through the confidential informant or things that we had picked up during the response to this incident. It was basically a short list of cards that were known to be compromised. And these were accounts that were set up or that may have been inactive that the attackers targeted, got access to those numbers, basically got all the information, cloned cards, and were basically ready to use in this cash out scheme. And then looked at the associated accounts with those cards. Day 10, further analysis of the ATM application and the core application. Again, going back through that access review, making sure that the servers are actually firewalled off, doing account resets, monitoring again, finding that mismatched data, looking for more indicators of compromise. And again, they were, we had good business people associated with these applications, but at the time, IT was almost completely blind to this ATM application. They knew it had existed, they knew how it worked as far as interconnection, but never really understood all of the information that came out of it or how it would be correlated to that core application. So this was a big learning process for us and also the client. Day 11, expansion of the application and server analysis. Again, starting from the point where we thought the compromise was most likely to take place and then working back from there, making sure that we were looking at all the servers and the network that was associated with those servers. So doing access review, not only on the critical assets or where we thought things would be targeted, but stepping back to domain controllers, regular infrastructure type devices, database servers, application servers, and going through the same steps, doing an access review, access resets, making sure that people had good passwords on the admin accounts or any type of service accounts, and then making sure that we were set up as far as monitoring went. 12 through 21 was, more of the same, monitoring. We had already gotten a lot of good information as far as the cards, the accounts that were associated with it, all that good stuff. We had some indicators of compromise that were fed back into our system and we were looking for, and it was just continuous monitoring. Found a lot of machines with malware, pretty typical for an environment of the size of this client. People surfing, downloading things, doing things that they shouldn't do per the security policy. But at the same time, we had so many eyes on this that we were picking it up almost instantaneously and moving on it. On day 22, that analysis of that user 3 machine that was back on, I think it was day 8. Like I said, we were doing a quick level forensic analysis just to kind of do a triage, and then we would go back and do a deeper analysis. Once that user 3 machine was complete, we found that there was an infection. Looked to it had occurred about 6 months prior, which was a little bit concerning to us. It was also found to be for something that ended up turning out to be the Zeus Trojan, which is pretty, I don't want to say common, but it's been out there for a long time. There are a lot of variants of it. It seems to morph very quickly, so usually as quickly as it's found, it morphs. Day 23 through 28, we were doing monitoring. Expansion of that monitoring, we had tied in some of the physical security monitoring that they were able to do, not only through their branches in the actual ATM network, but some of the advanced stuff that we had found out that they could do on the ATM network based on transactions and triggering on card events for specific cards. And again, it was just the expansion of that monitoring. And I say more monitoring here because it was almost like we were poring over this information and just making sure that we were looking at all of it, so that what we had put together, basically that intelligence piece, the indicators of compromise, not only from what we've seen through multiple client engagements and breach investigations, but also the stuff that was very specific to this case was being monitored, and we just kind of expanded that over their entire infrastructure and application base. Day 29, we actually, and this is part of where we moved into that prosecutorial help, we actually sat down with the confidential informant, that should say informant, not information meeting. At this time, it was interesting because the Secret Service had basically reached out to the client. We had been working with them, just sharing information, making sure that we were all on the same track. They had asked us to basically come in and sit directly with the confidential informant. It was a little bit of a, there were a couple different reasons there. Number one, they wanted to make sure that this person wasn't bluffing, that they were actually telling the truth, and then also to see if we could get the confidential informant to lead the infiltrators down a path where we could gain more information about them, where they were coming from, attack vectors, basically anything that could be used in the prosecution or continuing investigation of this particular organization. Again, from here forward, a lot of monitoring. When we had this confidential informant meeting, it was pretty interesting. We were doing very heavy monitoring. We were looking at things kind of with a fine-tooth comb just to see if we could find anything. And again, from here, from day 30 to forever, monitoring, expansion of monitoring, more assessment type of stuff. What was supposed to happen, and this is kind of the start of the wrap-up here, just to give you an idea, was that they gained access. So it was basically through a phishing attack, again, targeting the weakest link there. The malware would be downloaded onto some particular user's system, which we did find that happened. Malware with the command and control capabilities, which was Zeus, which is kind of scary because there's a lot of variants, and you see this quite frequently in incidents that have a big impact. And then there was that propagation of access. So they were going to change fraud monitoring rules. They were going to change velocity rules and timing rules around specific accounts. This was already done. We had seen that a lot of the fraud monitoring controls had been changed. Things were basically set up. They had gone in and started testing this stuff. So they had real accounts that they were putting real money into, and changing and going into the ATM network with the cards that were basically clone cards to make sure that the fraud monitoring rules were disabled for those particular accounts. And this is where we got that information, where we were actually tracking the cards associated with them. The next step that they were going to try to do is basically large wire transfer. With the fraud monitoring, they had actually disabled these rules so that a large transfer from account to account, even if they weren't associated, wouldn't have been caught. However, they were not able to gain access to the wire transfer system where they would have been able to actually authorize that type of transfer. And then account administration, which goes back to that wire transfer. So pumping one specific account or several different specific accounts full of money, or basically making up the money, changing a balance, in addition to doing that wire transfer. Then the account setup, inactive account target. This is where they wanted to basically get a foothold into the environment and kind of keep that, because this was something very persistent. They wanted to work this over a period of time and see what they can do, and move money. They wanted to set up accounts that weren't real accounts, that were fake accounts, where they could move large amounts of money in, correlate them to an ATM card, and then the move money part, this is where it was very different for us, because they were doing all of these things on the back end, basically setting up the foundation for this actual scheme. The fraud monitoring was the one piece that they tested out pretty extensively. The wire transfer piece they were able to do to a certain extent. The account administration piece was where they had kind of gotten stopped at this point, but it was the point that they felt most confident about from what we had seen and what we had learned about them. They thought that was the easy part. The fraud monitoring and the wire transfer pieces were going to be the hard part. Their idea was to set this all up and basically quickly do a pump and dump type scheme where move a lot of money into a couple accounts. The cards that they had associated with those accounts distributed or cloned throughout the United States or in specific geographic areas. So we're not talking one person, one card walking in and hitting an ATM and basically trying to empty it. We're talking hundreds of people basically walking into hundreds of ATMs with these cards, putting in the information and basically emptying out ATMs at the time. They weren't able to do that. And it would have been an unlimited cash out type scheme. Basically as much money was in those ATMs. The point was to try to get all of the cash out of them. That's where the foot soldiers came in, and then they'd slowly take their cut and move the money up to basically up the chain. Probably would have been laundered and found its way overseas. The scary thing about this, and obviously the nexus to federal law enforcement, is not only just the monetary impact associated with it, but the fact that a lot of these organizations do this to fund other things, drugs, terrorism, whatever it may be. So this is why this was a little bit different for us, because the motivation was a little bit different. What really happened and kind of how we came into play here. The access happened, the malware happened, propagation of access where they had the fraud monitoring, wire transfer, a little bit of account administration, had set up some accounts or used inactive target accounts to try to move money. And then this is where we really stepped in. We were doing that hardening, the monitoring, access cleanup, complete visibility into the environment. And that's really where it stopped. We had planted accounts, there were cards and fraud roles, coordination through the confidential informant with the international perpetrators, but this is where it really kind of all broke down for them. And it was interesting because it's not that we had caught them with the monitoring or the intrusion detection and the intelligence and the platform type stuff that we had in place, but since we were doing it in coordination and at the same time that we were doing our hardening and the access cleanup and kind of moving in a fashion where we weren't just trying to contain or monitor the environment and kind of be passive about it, but taking a more proactive approach, making sure that the environment was set up correctly as far as the security infrastructure and what we were monitoring, it kind of stopped dead in its tracks. We weren't really sure, the level of access that they had other than what we had proven, but what we had seen from the confidential informant and the information that we had gotten as we were talking through him to the other perpetrators was that they didn't have access anymore. They had been shut out in some way, whether that was the segmentation or the egress filtering. We're not really sure, but the bottom line is that the approach that we took wasn't just about responding to the incident and finding out what happened, which of course there'd be some evidentiary value to, but coordinating with the client to make sure that we're actually securing the environment, hardening it, doing that access cleanup, and in doing that we were able to not only provide them with a lot of information and kind of peace of mind as far as what didn't happen, but actually put them in a better stance as far as their security organization goes. This is just some of the information that came out of it. This is a case study that we kind of wrote up that goes along with that type of stuff. You can see the advisory that came out about it, ATM Unlimited Cash Out Advisory, directly from the Secret Service through DHS and kind of through the financial services, the coordination there, and through the CERT Coordination Center. The other part of this is our managed security services, because we had put so much of this in place and we were doing incident response over and over again. We had put a lot of these things in place, and this client actually turned to us and said, "This is great, you've really helped us out, this has really been a great thing. Can we leave everything in place now, please? Because we're really, really happy with how the monitoring is going and what you guys have found." So we had kind of morphed this into a managed security service that's, it's kind of changed what we've done and kind of how we're doing as far as our business. At our incident response, I'm just kind of going to touch on this at a high level since we're getting close to the hour. We were doing multiple things, and I hope that's apparent through this case study. We were doing network monitoring, network analytics, system monitoring, host analytics and forensics, data analytics, and then obviously that other piece with the environment hardening on the network side and the application side. On the network monitoring, we had placed our intrusion detection sensors, snort, not only at the gateway but then also for critical hosts and that segmentation of the environment. And the part of this that I had said about the intelligence is that we were looking for the general threat, some of the stuff that's normally built into this type of thing, the buffer overflows, port scans, known bad type things. We also use emerging threats, something that is a little bit more, I guess, newer concept where you actually pay for the intelligence feed that comes into this, where we're able to see command and control servers, zero-day type attacks, and new malware that's out there. We also have our custom threat feed, non-domestic IPs, indicators from malware found, or intelligence from internal threat feeds like customers, FBI, This is the stuff that we build as part of our own intelligence feed. And then that fraud watch, customized rules to monitor the known suspected fraud accounts and identities. And this is, again, stuff that goes into our network monitoring platform. The network analytics, all traffic was captured from sensors. Tons of data. We were really doing this more because we wanted to make sure that all the bases were covered. Statistical analysis of the account actions, really looking for anomalous activities. And during our confidential informant meeting, we were going to look at this in depth to make sure that we didn't miss anything, so even if our monitoring didn't pick it up, we had the information to go back. If a threat was found, we could have gone back and looked at the actual traffic that was captured from all of those sensors. On the system monitoring side, again, starting where the evidentiary value was high, we did use the endpoint monitoring suite Carbon Black, which firm believers in it. It's actually part of our radar solution. Looks at files, processes, files and registration, manipulation, and network connections. It is basically like a black box flight recorder for any endpoint. It's very lightweight. Helped us do the root cause analysis, basically show the impact of running processes across the entire enterprise. So we would look at, specific things on an endpoint, but then be able to tie that back to all of the other activity, either on the network side or servers, whatever it may be, and show whether it was isolated or propagating. If something moved along, we could show that it was the same process through 4 different servers or whatever it may be. Host analytics and forensics, again, going back to, we were doing that triage type approach to forensics, looking at a couple different things, whether it was anomalous network traffic or event logs, and then also user complaints, system slowness or strange behavior, and then other systems were targeted because of perceived threats. Wire transfer servers or desktops that would be connecting to the wire transfer machines, fraud monitoring, and then the core banking administration type applications. Again, just hitting on the rapid response forensic examination. We'd feed all that information or things that were found to the threat feeds, and then if there was something to move on, we would do that deeper forensic examination. The data analytics, this is more really just about those outsourced security provider, those outsourced application providers, pulling in those application logs, access logs, and then also looking at in-house data, bank account transactions, bank account lists. So stuff that was typically not, what you would see as far as security monitoring, but really the application information and trying to correlate it to the business logic that was associated with this particular breach. Just kind of shows, how we look at this as opposed to just the security information, really the business logic that goes along with it. And then the hardening, the traffic consolidation, the network architecture with the egress filtering so that they couldn't connect back to the command and control servers, and then also on the application side, the web proxy, obviously this was in place, we just kind of continued the implementation on it and helped them along a little bit. And then on the actual application side, the core banking applications, enforcing complex passwords, making sure that the database was cleaned up, making sure that only people that needed to connect to that core banking application did that, and making sure that we knew who was actually using those databases accounts for the application. We did see a lot of authorization problems here. Read-write access when read would have been sufficient, which is unfortunately somewhat typical with applications just because we all want them to work really well in IT. And then the Windows domain compromise that placed the application servers at risk. So again, segmenting how applications access the administration and even some of the services with that core banking application. Server and application administrative accounts is probably stuff that, if you've done any type of assessment, findings that come up or have come up at some point, local accounts on critical servers set up outside of the domain for a limited number of personnel. They had a lot of in-domain accounts that had functions that they really didn't need access to. So again, this was some rudimentary type cleanup stuff that we found, and it was problematic throughout their environment. Strong passwords, different usernames, and domain accounts that were dropped into local administrators groups and other groups just in favor of using local accounts that could be set up with more stringent security controls. Host-based firewalls, just to do not only the segmentation for the servers, but then also on specific hosts, and some of the things that we did around that as far as blacklisting and only allowing trusted hosts. This was more of a temporary solution during the active incident, and then help them do a network re-architecture once the incident was over. I know I kind of flew through that last part. I do apologize for that. When I put the presentation together, it was about 2 hours, so I tried to get as much information as I possibly could out. I know there were a lot of people that were interested in in learning about it, learning what was done, and just kind of talking about what was done, because it was a little bit of a different situation for us. If you want to ask me a question, I know we're kind of at the hour there, and I want to be mindful of everybody's time. If you want to go ahead and send me a chat, I can do that, and then I can unmute your line and go ahead and allow you to ask the question, or feel free to email me a question, give me a call later on. Again, my contact information is there, my full email address, ronschleck@BTB Security. Some of you have already talked to me, know me. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email if there's no questions now. And I'm more than happy to talk about this. I can send you the case study, I can send you the advisory that was put around it, or really the service that came around this service here. But I'll just leave it open for a couple minutes. If anybody has a question, again, feel free to raise your hand or send me a chat real quick, and we can go from there. But I thank you all for joining me, and I hope it was beneficial for everyone.